Hello, this is Yejoon Lee from ADAS Lab, and in this week 4 of Mastering Diffusion seminar, we'll talk about the Denoising Diffusion Probabilistic Model, or DDPM. First, we will review the last sessions. In the last session, we've learned about the variational inference. The goal of variational inference is to model the likelihood of X. However, as direct modeling is hard, we marginalize X over some latent Z. This would require integration over the entire Z, which will be most of the times intractable. So we instead sample the latent Z from some Q and take an expectation over the sampler Q. Again, for tractability, we use Jensen's inequality, and this expectation becomes the objective of variational inference. After some few tweaks, you can see that this objective is equivalent to the variational inference objective you've seen in the last session. We also learned about the model using variational inference, and that is VAE, the variational autoencoder. We won't go in details of VAE in here, but the essence of VAE is that the latent variable is a normally distributed random vector. DDPM is just the same as VAE, but the difference here is that the latent variable is a normally distributed random vectors connected via Markov chain. So instead of a single latent vector as in VAE, there are multiple latent vectors in DDPM. And these multiple latent vectors are not just unrelated latent vectors. They are connected via the Markov chain. And this means that the distribution of xt is only affected by xt minus 1 and not by xt minus 2 or t minus 3 or so on. And before we dive deeper to DDPM, there are some few notes on the notations used in DDPM. When we write as this, px equals n and blah blah, we simply means that the px is the density of this Gaussian. And you can see that the variance of Gaussian here is denoted as sigma square identity. And this special type of Gaussian is known as the isotropic Gaussian. And in DDPM, this special case of Gaussian will be mostly used. And second is the reparameterization trick. And if we write x like this, mu plus sigma epsilon, where epsilon is the standard Gaussian noise, we simply mean that this x is the Gaussian random vector with mean mu and variance sigma square identity. The benefit of this notation is that we isolate the randomness to this epsilon, which is the standard Gaussian. Mu and sigma is given from this distribution, and they are both fixed. So this is it for the background review, and we will now see the reverse process and the forward process, which are the two core processes of DDPM. First, we will see the reverse process. And reverse process is getting the data from latent. In other words, in this part we see how to denoise the noisy latents to get the true data x0. And obviously this reverse process needs to be done with our model theta. And this p theta of x0 to t is defined as follows: p of x large t multiplied by p theta xt minus 1 given xt, and these are all connected via the Markov chain. And here, Markov chain of reverse process is divided into two parts: pure Gaussian noise at time step large t, and learned transition afterward. Notice the difference in subscript. In pure noise x large t, there is no model parameter theta, while transition afterward is learned with the model. This learned transition is also modeled as a Gaussian noise. As a result, the model can learn the mean and the variance of a Gaussian instead of directly modeling the density. Reverse process, which we've just seen, learns to decode from the latent variables, or in other words, denoises. In contrast, forward process defines the latent variables of DDPM, or in other words, adds noise into the data. Just like the reverse process, forward process is also modeled as a Markov chain, where each transition is modeled by Gaussian. There is a deeper background on why forward and backward can be both Markov Gaussian, but that will be covered more in the next lecture. The forward process, q of xt given xt minus 1, is defined by a Gaussian with mean square root 1 minus beta t xt minus 1 and variance beta t identity. Notice how beta t controls the mean and the variance. And as you can see, if beta t is 1, q becomes a pure standard Gaussian, whereas if beta t is 0, q simply becomes xt minus 1 without any variance. Therefore, this beta t controls the randomness, the noise level of this Gaussian distribution. An important characteristic of DDPM is that this variance schedule is fixed, not learned. As a result, there is no trainable component in this forward process Q. This is in contrast to generative models like VAE, where the latent encoder Q also contains learnable parameters. Another important characteristic of DDPM is a so-called variance preserving property. This means that if variance of xt minus 1 is identity, then also the variance of xt is identity. Later in this talk, you will see how we normalize the images, so the pixels, to align with the standard Gaussian. This makes x0 to have variance somewhat close to identity. Then due to this variance preserving property, the variance of xt is preserved to be near identity throughout the time steps t. This helps the stable training of DDPM. This variance preserving property will also be revisited in the next lecture, where we analyze the DDPM through the lens of differential equation. A crucial property of DDPM is that it admits sampling from an arbitrary time step. So recall this definition of forward process. It is only defined from xt minus 1 to xt. However, it actually admits sampling from x0 to xt at arbitrary t. And this could be given as this closed form formula. Here, alpha t is defined as 1 minus beta t, where the bar of alpha t is defined as the product of alpha 1 until the alpha t. Now let's see how this closed form formula for q of xt given x0 can be derived. So xt was defined as follow, and here we use the reparameterization trick. And let alpha t to be 1 minus beta t, and we could simply substitute beta t with alpha t. And if we plug in the same formula for the xt minus 1, we get this. And if we look at these two blue terms, we have to remember that the epsilon t minus 2 and epsilon t minus 1 is independent. And this is due to the Markov property of latent variables in DDPM. So we could simply set this weighted sum of epsilon t minus 2 and epsilon t minus 1 to be tilde epsilon t. And this tilde epsilon t is a Gaussian noise with mean 0 and various 1 minus alpha t minus 1. And now we could do this recursively and get the following result. Now we move on to the training and sampling of DDPM. So a short recap, latent variable in DDPM is a Markov chain of random vectors. And as mentioned earlier, DDPM uses variational inference where the latent variables are the Markov latent vectors. The overall logic of variational inference is identical to VAE, but there are a few noticeable changes. First, you can see that there is no subscript for this Q because we defined the Fourier process without any learnable component. And in this last line, P and Q is decomposed via the Markov property. So this last line becomes the objective of DDPM using variational inference. Skipping to conclusion, the loss you see here is the result from variational inference, which we will use as the loss function to optimize theta. We will get later how this loss is derived from the previous variational inference loss. So here, the first term is a KL divergence between Q of x large t given x0 and P of x large t. However, there is no need to include this term in the loss because there is no trainable component here. The next term with this sigma is the core term in the loss. And this term is the KL divergence between the forward posterior and the model. We will dive deeper in the next slides. And this last term will be incorporated into the left term. Before seeing how this loss is derived from variational inference, let's first break down the second term. We have the model density, P theta, and a sort of ground truth from Q. But remember that Q is defined as a Fourier process from t-1 to t. So how can we know the density of t-1 given t from this Q? And the answer is the Bayes rule. The Bayes rule tells us the reverse probability or the forward posterior even though Q is defined as a forward process. So you could see how the Bayes rule is applied in these equations. So now we will see how this loss is derived from variational inference. And here is a little helper from Bayes rule. So this line is the last line from the variational inference slide, from which we start. And here, so we simply separate out the t equals 1 term. And following the Bayes rule, the screen term is decomposed as these blue terms. And here, if we look at this fraction, and because this is multiplied over t equals 2 to large T, it will keep cancel out. And this is what we were left with, Q of x1 given x0 over q of x large t given x0. And then it's a simple move. So this q of x large t given x0 goes here, and q of x1 given x0 goes, I'm sorry, it is cancelled out with this term. So we get this line. And the rest is a simple transformation to KL divergence. And this is the final loss from the variational inference. So from now on, we will refer to this as L large T. So I think we won't refer this because this is not the part of the loss. And this will be referred as the LT minus 1 and this as the L0 because this is the density of x0 and this is the KL divergence between the forward posterior and the model density of xt minus 1. Now we will see how to calculate the second term, LT minus 1, which is the core term of DDPM loss. There are two components in this KL divergence, which we should both know. First is the posterior, q of xt minus 1 given xt and x0, and second is the model density p theta xt minus 1 given xt. So let's first see the posterior. As mentioned earlier, this q of xt minus 1 given xt and x0 is derived from the base rule. And these three lines are the facts we already know. This is the definition and forward process. This is the sampling of xt given x0. And this is what we get from the Bayes theorem and the use of Markov property. So from this Bayes theorem, if we ignore the normalization constant, q of xt minus 1 given xt and x0 is proportional to q of xt given xt minus 1 multiplied by q of xt minus 1 given x0. And without showing, we will use the fact that the product of two isotropic Gaussian density is still an isotropic Gaussian density. So we could write this density as a Gaussian density of mu tilde t and beta tilde t times identity. So from now on, it's just a math. So we know the formula for Gaussian density. So if you do just the math, you will get the beta tilde t and mu tilde t. And I will skip the details in the talk, but I think you will get the essence from this slide. So this q of xt minus 1 given xt and x0 is modeled as an isotropic Gaussian, and mean mu tilde t is a mixture of xt and x0, and the weight is given by alphas and betas. So basically, the weight is given by the variance schedule. Okay, so we've seen the posterior. Now let's see the model. P theta xt minus 1 given xt. So in the reverse process, we have defined this P of theta as a Gaussian density. So this means that there are two parameters we need to estimate, which is the mu theta and the sigma theta. And here we add a little assumption. We fix the variance as an untrained time-dependent constant sigma squared t identity. So the variance of P theta is fixed as some sigma t and is not trained. This sigma t is largely a design choice, which we will see more in the later section. Now that we've fixed the variance, the KL divergence between two isotropic Gaussians becomes a L2 distance between their mean. We will omit a detailed proof here. If you could recall, the mean a posterior is given in a closed form as a mixture of xt and x0. But how do we model this posterior mean with mu theta? A simple and naive solution is to build a neural network that receives xt and t as inputs and outputs mu theta, which is the estimate for mu tilde t. However, this turns out to be a kind of a dumb approach. And this is because we already know a lot of parts of mu tilde t, this blue part. As the variance schedule beta and its complement alpha are fixed, starting from training, we know the coefficients of xt and x0. And furthermore, we already know the xt. So directly approximating the mean is possible, but quite dumb. And if we look at this mu tilde t, we only don't know x0. So it will be a nice solution to only approximate x0. But actually, we could go more from x0. Remember how xt is given x0 is given as this Gaussian density. And by reparameterization, we get xt as this. And this formula shows that we could get xt from x0 with standard Gaussian epsilon t. But by reversing this formula, we can get x0 from xt in a closed form solution like this. So through this reparameterization, we isolate the randomness of xt into epsilon t. So again, this alpha t is what we know and xt is given. So now epsilon t is the only vector we need to model. We only don't know the epsilon t. Now let's combine the formula for posterior and formula for relationship between x0 and xt and epsilon t. So again, this is just the simple math, and the color will guide you if you're confused. And now we reparameterize the formula for posterior mean as a function of xt and epsilon t, not xt and x0. As explained before, this is a better parameterization as it clearly breaks down the posterior mean into xt, which we know for sure, and epsilon t, which we never know. So again, if we define mu tilde t as such, the modeled mean mu theta is also modeled as such. We only need to predict the epsilon t, which will be modeled as epsilon theta. Now recall that our loss term of interest, Lt minus 1, is a L2 distance between the posterior mean and the model mean. Now that we've reparameterized this mean with xt and epsilon t, the L2 distance of mean turns into the L2 distance between epsilon weighted by the variance schedule, this alpha and beta, and the fixed variance of reverse process, sigma t. Recall that this expectation in the loss term is an expectation over Q. Q basically samples latents from the data x0, and the only random part in this latent sampling is the epsilon t. Noise is always sampled from the standard Gaussian, and the degree of noise in the latent is controlled by the variance schedule. So the noise epsilon t, so the noise epsilon t, is actually not dependent on t. Therefore, we simply drop the t in epsilon and take an expectation over the standard Gaussian standard Gaussian epsilon. And obviously, we also take an expectation over the true data x0. Now, this is something very close to the actual loss term of DDPM. And in DDPM, actually a simpler variant is used, and this loss discards all the weighting factors of this L2 loss. And the authors of DDPM simply states that it is beneficial to sample quality and is simpler to implement. So this is it for LT-1, which is the core of DDPM loss. And now we will revisit the L0. And I've earlier said that this will be incorporated into LT-1, and we will see the details now. The problem with L0 is that there is no stochasticity in the ground truth x0. For all the other xt's, xt is given as a density, so we could calculate it, a KO divergence between this density and model density. However, there is no such thing as a density of x0. There is only a single fixed point x0, which is the true data. Therefore, what we effectively do is to calculate the L2 loss of the data and the mean of the model density. And this intuitively makes sense. The simple loss we've seen in the last slides is basically this L2 distance between the data and the mean of model density if we plug t equals 1, ignoring the constant. Now let's wrap up the training process of DDPM. As shown in this pseudocode, we take a gradient update step on this loss we derived. Sampling is done on true data x0 times step t and the noise epsilon. And this effectively means that DDPM learns to denoise from any time step. Given the noisy latent xt at time step t, it predicts the noise. Predicting the noise means predicting the data, as we can simply subtract the predicted noise from the noisy latent xt. And when sampling from the prior x large t, DDPM gradually denoises. The density of next latent xt-1 is sampled from the density p. And this model p consists of the modeled mean from epsilon theta and the untrained fixed variance. One noticeable thing is that in principle, x0 can be generated from any time step. Since epsilon t is predicting the noise from data to current given latent, we can simply subtract the noise to get the data. So if we recall the formula for q of xt given x0, you could reverse that to go from xt to x0. However, this does not mean you can generate good samples from any time step without gradually denoising. And this is because during DDPM training, we train over latents from different time steps from t equals 1 to large T. And skipping time step won't be beneficial for sampling because some valuable information might be hidden in the latents of those skipped time steps. And now we move on to the implementation of DDPM. And this could be a very specific design choice of the original paper of DDPM, and this or may not extend to other diffusion models. So far we discussed continuous densities, but image is in fact not continuous. And given an image, we rescale each pixels so that the distribution of pixel aligns with our assumption, the standard normal prior. And when generating a fixed image from the modeled density P theta x0 given x1, we integrate the Gaussian density over each bin. For instance, the probability mass for pixel 243 would be the integration of this Gaussian density over 230 over 255 to 232 over 255. And this is the pixel level probability mass, and the image level probability mass is simply a product of all pixel level probability masses. And the variance schedule beta t is a hyperparameter when training and sampling from DDPM. And in this original paper, beta t is set as increasingly linear, where beta 1 is 10 to the minus 4 and beta large t is 0.02. And you can see that this is very small compared to the pixel range minus 1 to 1. And there's also this another hyperparameter, sigma t, which is the variance of our model density, the reverse process. And the DDPM paper shows two candidates. The first is beta t, which is the variance of forward process, q of xt given xt minus 1. And the second is beta t multiplied by this. And this is the variance of forward posterior, q of xt minus 1 given xt and x0. And original DDPM paper reports similar results for above 2. So this was it for DDPM. And now let's see the upcoming topics. So in week 5, we will dive deeper into diffusion models. And crucially, we will see the SDE, stochastic differential equation, and score matching perspective. And if you found DDPM to be slightly unintuitive in this session, you may want to look at this week 5 lecture, as SDE and score matching perspective could be more intuitive to understand DDPM. And in week 6, we look at diffusion models working in discrete space, such as tokens, or in latent space. And in week 7, we look at various technical components of DDPM. For example, how do we do conditional generation with diffusion model, or how could we reduce the required time step for sampling? And after these 3 sessions, we will see more of diffusion language models. And this was it for this lecture, and thank you for listening.